We'd go and visit my granddad and my nana quite often, should they lived in the next village. And their house used to always be full. My nana, I remember, had lots and lots of children, even though they were grown up now. And possibly some of them were still quite teenagers. I'm not sure, I can't really remember that. All I do remember is her house being full and my granddad saying, come on, let's go into the garden, or let's go to the shed. His shed was a brick shed. And I knew when we went there, he was going to give me a present. My granddad was one to expose himself whenever he felt like it. I believed, looking back now, he'd sit on the garden bench and just ask me to put my hand in his pocket, so I could feel my present. I remember him taking me into his garden shed, which is, like I said, a brick shed, which was just, I guess, like an outhouse. And there were skinned rabbits there were lots of tools, and he would just expose himself. And I remember once he said that he really wanted me to drink my present, and he forced himself into my mouth. And I remember I thought I was being sick, and it was just dreadful. And then we would just go back into the house and carry on as normal, whatever normal was. I remember one day being at school. I'm not sure how old I was, but I remember I must have been about year 3, because I remember the teacher. She was a lovely lady, and I came down with the measles, and back then things were different, so there was no phone call home. The teacher just said, I'll drive you home, and she drove me home, and nobody was there, so she drove me to my nana at my granddad's house, and my nana was out. And I remember walking in there, and my teacher sitting down with my granddad, and my teacher, who was so lovely, sort of saying, will you be okay? It's the measles. And I remember my granddad just sitting in his chair saying, she'll be fine here, she'll be all right. And inside I was just thinking, please, please don't leave me here, please. And she went. And my grandfather stood up. I remember this as plain as day, 52, and I remember this as if it was yesterday. He stood up, he walked over to me, and I was feeling really, really poorly. My throat hurt, I felt hot and itchy, and he said to me, I suppose you don't feel like it. You don't feel like you're present. So he stood in front of me, exposed himself, until he could give me my present himself. And then he asked me to reach into his pocket, pull out his handkerchief, and I had to clean him. And I remember that as if it was yesterday, as if it happened to me yesterday. So I know I'm not the only one. I know I am not the only person that remembers these things that vividly. I remember going home. I remember my mum coming and I being an inconvenience because I was off school, because it was an inconvenience. Was I really that bad? And I remember just going up to the landing and just wanting to sit with my friend, who I thought was my invisible friend, but I know now she was my spirit guide. And I remember talking to her out loud. And I remember my brothers taking the mickey out of me. Oh, she's talking again. She's talking to herself. And so from that day on, I decided the only time I would talk to my lovely friend, my invisible friend, would be in my head. And when I learnt to speak to her in my head, I could speak to her anywhere. It didn't have to be at the top of the landing, which was absolutely amazing. And so every time the fire went on, every time I had to go into the shed, every time I had to have a present, every time I felt a buckle on my tummy button, every time I felt the smell or smelt the smell of soap, it was okay, because this lovely voice in my head was telling me it was going to be okay and it would soon be over. The day my granddad died, and I tiptoed and looked into his coffin, I felt really, really happy, because I knew no longer did I have to have any presents. See you soon.